Hello everyone, Hyper here, and in today's video we'll be discussing the Unholy DK. There was a recent blue post which confirmed that we are getting Unholy and Frost DK changes in the near future on the beta servers, but before those changes get pushed, I kind of wanted to get my ideas out there and have a little discussion about what the core problem with this class is and maybe how it could be improved going to the next expansion. First of all, let's talk about baseline abilities and what is one core problem with the Unholy DK. We have a very hard time target swapping, and it takes quite a bit of ramp time to target swap, and this is a big issue in Mythic Plus, and whenever we're required to swap to an ad in raids that maybe is not right next to the boss. So Festering Wounds, as you can see, this was the spell that was implemented in Legion. It stacks on the target, and then it's basically a builder spender where we build Festering Wounds and then we spend them with our Scourge Strike. But this makes target swapping much more difficult, and this is a similar way to how rogues used to work in the past, where they built combo points on their target. And after a lot of complaining, and how Blizzard figured out that this is just a bad playstyle and it feels very bad for target swapping, and also if you lose combo points, or in this case Festering Wounds, because the target dies, even though you might get the damage if there's other targets nearby, it still feels bad because then you have to go ahead and build wounds on another target. So it would be ideal if these wounds could stack on our weapon. So I know that thematically this doesn't make sense because you wound your target, so this would need to be renamed to something else. But if we had a similar mechanic that stacks on our weapon or on ourselves, which then we can spend on regardless of which target we hit, that would make target swapping much easier. It would waste less overall runes, and it would just make the spec feel a little bit smoother to play. Now, the second big problem is that we're losing Apocalypse. And as you saw in Legion, Apocalypse became a really big core part of Unholy DK. And this whole class fantasy of summoning ghouls and having a mini army up pretty frequently and having as many pets as possible. And with Apocalypse being gone, all we have now is Army of the Dead. And even that is still a long cooldown, so it's a 10-minute cooldown, so we just get that once a fight. And Unholy is supposed to play similar to Demonology Warlock, where we empower our pets and they do most of the damage while we kind of support them. So if we want to go ahead with this thematically, Apocalypse needs to be made baseline. And this would also require a talent to synergize with it, because just baseline Apocalypse feels okay to use on AoE since you're bursting all those wounds, but on single target Apocalypse doesn't feel that great because the ghouls that come out of it honestly don't do that much damage, especially since we're losing our artifact weapon, and ghouls will now not apply different debuffs to the target and then explode whenever they expire. So we would need a talent similar to the shoulders that Unholy has, where we can actually empower the pets that we summon. The third baseline ability, which I have an issue with, is Death and Decay. And this ability feels great to use as a Blood DK, and it really makes sense, but as an Unholy DK, this doesn't really fit into our playstyle. And this stationary playstyle where we just drop it in one spot and then we just have to stay there, and we're only able to cleave stuff that's within our Death and Decay. So in the past we had an ability called Unholy Blight, which was on a 1-minute cooldown if I remember correctly, and whenever it activated, it works similar to Bone Storm where it damaged things around us, and it also applied dots, so in this case it would be Virulent Plague. I'm fine if they remove the Virulent Plague component from it because we're already able to spread that to all of our targets with Outbreak. But going into the next expansion, I feel like it's important to rework the class in a way that it makes sense for it to work. So with this ability, it would work very similar to Blade Flurry. If you play the Combat Rogue or Outlaw Rogue, you know that Blade Flurry allows you to cleave in an 8-yard radius around you. So regardless of if the targets are in front of you or behind you, as long as they're 8 yards around your target, you're able to cleave to them. And of course, on our character or on our specialization, this would only apply to Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike, but it would still be nice to have that thematic of an insect swarm around the character applying dots to everything around us and dealing damage while allowing us to cleave. And this would also counteract the problem that Death and Decay has as an ability. It is stationary. You drop it in one place and it's just there. If you have to kite mobs and you have to kite them out of your Death and Decay, it basically becomes useless. If, for example, in a Mythic Plus, if you had Unholy Blight instead of Death and Decay, and the tank was kiting the mobs, you would be able to keep up to them while cleaving them. So next, let's take a look at the talents. And within the talents, there's quite a few that I think are just fine, but there's a few which, at their core, don't really work well with the class anymore. In the first row, Ebon Fever. So this was a great talent and the go-to in Legion. But why was it so good? Well, mostly because of Plague Bearer. So our Virulent Plague ticks faster and it does more damage. So this means that with Plague Bearer on top of it, they had great synergy together to put out a massive amount of damage on both single target and AoE. So this completely removed Bursting Swords and All Will Serve from being a competitive talent for both single target and AoE. So we basically had two death talents because of an artifact trait. Now, in BFA I actually tried out Ebon Fever, and on AoE it does fall behind Bursting Swords, which would make sense because Bursting Swords, you gain exponential damage the more targets there are. Because every time you burst a wound, it deals damage to everything around it, and the more targets you have, the more it deals. And then if you have multiple wounds up on multiple targets because of Infected Claws, then you get even more damage out of it. So I think Ebon Fever needs to be slightly buffed to compensate for this, and it should be the go-to in periodic cleave fights. So on fights where you have ads spawn once in a while. And then Bursting Swords is really good for pure AoE, for example Mythic Plus situations. Then All Will Serve needs to be reworked in a way where it's actually the top single target damage on pure patchwork fights. So right now as it stands, All Will Serve does physical damage and it does not scale well with our stats. So it would make sense for your Skulker Shot, which is just the little archer damage, to do either shadow damage or increase its scaling so it actually keeps up on single target, at least with Ebon Fever. In the level 57 row, Epidemic is obviously the biggest talking point. This talent saw a lot of use in the Legion pre-patch because it was really strong, but then once we actually transitioned into Legion and it was kind of adjusted and we saw stats increased and scaling, it was basically a dead talent. You didn't take it in PvE or in PvP. In huge AoE situations, there was no situation where this talent was good. And one of the big reasons is because it has 3 charges and it costs 1 rune, and it does minimal damage also. So a great solution for this is to just remove it to 1 charge, so you just have 1 use of it and it's on an X amount of cooldown, and make it cost 3 runes. Because one of the big problems of Unholy DK is its ramping AoE damage. So we need to set up and ramp our AoE damage before we can actually get some damage out there. And especially with Apocalypse being gone, we need something that instantly deals AoE damage. So if this costs 3 runes and it just had 1 charge, we would have the burst of AoE damage that we needed. So we can run into a pack, we can outbreak, and then as soon as our Virulent Plague spreads to all of the targets, we can just press Epidemic, and then it should feel similar to a Living Bomb when used, rather than this thing that we weave in and it does no damage. So in Legion, this ability obviously had huge damage scaling issues. The other 2 talents in this row I'm fine with. BRW is at its core a well-designed talent, I think. And at Pestilent Pustules, it's okay in single target, and it also refunds some more runes in AoE because it has decent synergy with Infected Claws, so we get more wounds out there, and when we pop more wounds, we get more runes back. So overall, these 2 talents I'm fine with, where Pestilent Pustules is kind of the more passive style, and then BRW should be the more proactive and slightly more difficult to use talent. Then in the level 58 row, I think Unholy Frenzy and Clawing Shadows make sense because Unholy Frenzy synergizes well with Dark Arbiter and then Clawing Shadows with Defile. But Castigator at its core doesn't make much sense, because the way Castigator works, it scales off of our crit strike. And as Unholy DKs, we don't want crit, we want haste and we want mastery. And it doesn't really make sense to stack a secondary stat, just for one specific talent, and then build around a third row talent. It's not strong enough to justify building around it. And this is the main problem with it. A possible replacement for this would be Scourge of Worlds from our artifact weapon in Legion. So since UF synergizes with DA and then Clawing Shadows with Defile, Castigator, or if we replace it with Scourge of Worlds, would synergize with Soul Reaper. It would need to be adjusted slightly, because now we would have to make the choice between Castigator and Unholy Frenzy. So if we take Scourge of Worlds, then we would get less death coils overall, so its proc rate would need to go up slightly. But if it was adjusted, this build would kind of synergize with Soul Reaper overall. In the level 60 row, I have an issue with both Debilitating Infestation and Sludge Belcher. So DI at its core is just not useful. Basically every class has an AoE slow, and this is just not needed. It's a 50%, so it's weak by default, and it's just overall not that good because it only applies to Outbreak, it doesn't apply to Virulent Plague. I would be okay if this was nerfed to about 30% slow or 40%, and just incorporated into our base build. So whenever we have Outbreak, it should be a base part of Outbreak. And again, if this was a 30% slow, it would not make a huge difference, but it would still give us a little bit of a slow, maybe in the downtimes between when other classes are not able to drop theirs. And then if we need single target slow, we still have the 70% with Chains of Ice. Now Sludge Belcher, this has been a problematic talent ever since it was introduced, because it is a DPS increase in a row where we're supposed to choose between utility. So Sludge Belcher is an increase in utility because we get Smash and we get a second hook, as well as a DPS increase because it cleaves in a 360-degree radius instead of a 180. So this, as a talent, needs to be fixed, and it should never be a DPS increase to take Sludge Belcher over Asphyxiate or DI. It should just be a utility increase purely. Then in the level 90 row, I think Shadow Infusion is an okay talent and should be the default choice going for single target. But this means that our Dark Transformation would need to be buffed to compensate for the scaling, because on live, for single target, you take Infected Claws, because Dark Transformation by itself is just not strong enough to justify using SI, even if you're able to DT more often. So I think just our pet needs to do more damage whenever it's in its transformation, even if this means nerfing it slightly whenever it's out of the Dark Transformation. So this should be the default single target go-to. And then Necrosis honestly should be replaced with the Legion shoulder buff. So if you don't know what that is the legendary which whenever you press Dark Transformation, all of your pets that you have summoned get empowered. So this row kind of plays around Dark Transformation and your pet. So first talent, obviously, you can DT more often. The third row, your pet applies more wounds, so this is good for AoE. And then if we implemented a talent that would buff all of our current pets, which we have summoned down, this would synergize well with Dark Arbiter. And that's one thing that makes Dark Arbiter such a good talent, because it synergizes well with the shoulders. And then in the last row, the only talent that I have an issue with here is Soul Reaper. DA and Defile, I think, are good choices because DA is that solid single target damage, and Defile is that good AoE damage, even though it has a little bit of ramp time. I think they should remove the ramp from it and just give us flat mastery as soon as we drop it. But overall, I think it's a decent talent to use. A Soul Reaper gives us 21% haste every 45 seconds, and it lasts 15 seconds. So we have a 30-second cooldown basically on a mini Bloodlust. And this, in theory, is strong, but it requires setup. Again, this is one big problem of Unholy DK. Everything just requires setup and ramp. So if this somehow was just a base ability, similar to how Sephu's works, we just press it, fire and forget, then I would be okay with it. So if we just Soul Reaper and we gain 20% haste for 15 seconds, and it does some shadow damage, that would be okay. But the fact that we have to play around it, and especially in PvP, whenever you press it, you tend to get CC'd immediately. So playing around it, again, you have to keep track of enemies' stuns and all of that stuff. And then on live, you obviously, or in PvE, you obviously have to have wounds stacked up and then have enough runes where you can press your Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike 3 times in a row. So possible replacement for this talent, if it's not just reworked to be a fire and forget ability, would be just incorporating Cold Heart, and this would mean that we don't have the fluctuation in haste, so we just have a fire and forget ability that just does massive Shadow Frost damage. And it was kind of a fun ability to use even in PvP or in World PvP, and then in PvE also, whenever you needed a burst of damage, you can just save up your Cold Heart and then do that burst of damage. In Mythic Plus, for example, it was useful for ads that spawned on bosses, or in raids, you just used it on cooldown into the boss. The second possibility here would be incorporating the tier 24 piece. So what that did was essentially gave CDR to our Army of the Dead. Right now, Army is back to a 10-minute cooldown, and you will just use this once a fight, most likely. It's very rare that fights last more than 10 minutes. It's usually just the last boss or the last 2 bosses in a raid. If we had Army of the Dead more often, so it does cost 3 runes, and it summons ghouls, and it is a 10-minute cooldown. So if we had this more often, and they incorporated the portal to the underworld artifact trait into Army of the Dead, then this would be a solid choice, as long as we saw a buff to the damage of the ghouls. So this should kind of be a choice between single target and AoE, because DA is a purely single target DPS gain and you have to build around it. Defile on single target is not all that good, so this is mainly an AoE ability. We need something that's either good for cleave or something that's passive and we don't really have to worry about it too much. So I think either incorporating Army of the Dead to be a short cooldown and maybe use it every 2 to every 3 minutes, it would kind of aesthetically make sense for the class since we're summoning an Army of Dead. And it's also kind of a fun ability to use, and DK had an issue with overcapping resources anyway, so if we're ever running into that situation, 3 runes is quite a bit, and that kind of stabilizes our resource generation. I know this video is pretty long, but Unholy has a lot of core issues that need to be resolved going into the next expansion. And I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about the issues that Unholy has, and about possible solutions. If you agree or disagree with me on these, it's completely fine. I love to hear from you guys, and you always have great ideas and great feedback. So if you have any ideas, just leave them in the comment section. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and sub to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.